through over the course of time. We still see about 85% of our rescues from last season occurred outside of the flagged areas, and all of those fatalities were outside of the flagged areas. Quite a number of them are a relatively short distance from the flag, sort of 200 to 500 metres away, so we really encourage people to take that extra bit of time, be a lifesaver, and encourage your family and friends to stretch those legs out and walk up to those flagged areas. It makes their lives a lot easier, helping to look after you guys. Some of the other interesting things out of our Coast Safe report, which has been released this weekend as well, is that males still make up the majority of our rescue patients,
the G77
with 57% of the rescues being
its summit underway in Havana.
in the age bracket of 20 to 49 years, and 64% were males. So please, guys, take a bit of time and make sure that you don't take too many risks. Head to those flagged areas for us. About 780 of our 3,200 odd rescues were children under the age of 12. So we're really encouraging parents, family members, aunties and uncles, everyone that's taking their kids to the end of the beach to really make sure that you keep that supervision level high. Our lifesavers and lifeguards have got a lot of people between the flags that they've got to try to look after. So please support us to make sure that you're looking after the kids and making sure that they're staying in nice and close and not getting out of their depth and needing assistance. Last season we saw about 22 million visitations to our beaches, and that's only at the patrolled areas where we do those recordings. So our beaches are very, very busy. The population growth in Queensland, particularly in the southeast corner, means that our beaches are only continuing to get busier. And whilst we know that people want to spread out and have that piece of sand to themselves, when you are going to get into the water, please don't swim between those red and yellow flags. It really is a safe spot, and it makes our job as easy as possible, because if we can't see you, we can't save you.
Indeed, and there are many people, I expect, heading to the beach, especially along the east coast today, where temperatures will be high. Aaron Purchase from Surf Lifesaving Queensland there. You're listening to ABC News Radio, trying to get the very latest sport. Here's Fraser.
Thanks, Chris. Carlton AFL coach Michael Voss says he hasn't thought about team selection following their 2-point semi-final win over Melbourne at the MCG. Jack Martin will be available after serving a one-game suspension, and Harry Mackay is expected to be fit to travel to Brisbane. It'll be Carlton's first preliminary final in nearly a quarter of a century. Voss says the team will celebrate the win before moving forward.
To be able to get to there based on where we were and the climb we've had to have, this year, let alone last year, so we'll just sort of absorb it for now, I think. We'll have a couple of days rest and then we'll somehow turn ourselves back into next week.
North Melbourne great Phil Cracker is leading a group of Indigenous former football players who have launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse. Yvette Gray reports.
Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and move to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to the players. The 7 players who were employed between 1975 and 2022 claim the AFL knew or ought to have known of the immediate and long-term adverse consequences of experiencing racial vilification, both physical and verbal, on the players. Cracker says he and others have been deeply affected by the comments, and the lack of support from the AFL made it worse. He says sorry doesn't cut it, and he wants to ensure the game is better than when he played.
In a statement, the AFL says it has not been served with any documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it. In the NRL, the Melbourne Storm is into a preliminary final after beating the Sydney Roosters 18 points to 13 at Melbourne's Rectangular Stadium. The Roosters led 13-12 with under 2 minutes to play in their semi-final when Will Warbrick scored to secure victory for the Storm. Warbrick has told ABC Sport it was an exciting way to win a high-pressure match.
You kind of dream of those kind of moments, and I'm just glad I got the ball across the line, and I'm just glad we got the win. I'm so happy, proud of the team.
The Storm will take on the Penrith Panthers next Friday for a spot in the grand final. And also in the NRL, Newcastle prop Daniel Safiti has been ruled out of this afternoon's semi-final clash against the Warriors with a hamstring injury. Brodie Jones will come onto the bench while the rest of the team remains unchanged. Travis Head's Cricket World Cup is in doubt after he suffered a fractured hand during Australia's 164-run ODI loss to South Africa in Centurion. The opener suffered the blow to his left hand off a Gerald Coetzee delivery, which saw the 29-year-old retire hurt. Chasing 417 for victory, the visitors could only muster 252 in reply. Australian captain Mitch Marsh says sometimes you just get outplayed.
Yeah, if you look at the history of this ground, teams been able to make it up in the back 20. I think they scored 270 in the last 20 overs, which is incredible. We were certainly put under a lot of pressure towards the back end there, and sometimes in international cricket, you got to give your hats off to guys who, Hendrick had an amazing day today, and hats off to him.
The series is level at 2-all, with the final ODI to be played in Johannesburg. Cyclist Alberto Dainese has narrowly avoided a crash in the final kilometre to sprint to victory at stage 19 of the Vuelta in Spain. A touching of wheels saw several riders fall just over 2 kilometres from the finish, with the Italian inching out fellow countryman Filippo Ganna. American Sepp Kuss finished outside the top 50, but maintains a 17-second lead over the rest of the field. And finally, Ferrari's Carlos Sainz has topped the timesheet in Formula 1's second practice session at the Singapore Grand Prix. The Spaniard was close to 0.02 of a second clear of teammate Charles Leclerc, with Mercedes' George Russell in third. Championship leader Max Verstappen was 8th fastest behind Red Bull teammate Sergio Perez. Australian Oscar Piastri ended the session in 15th for McLaren. And that is the latest in sport. Chris?
With the ABC Listener, you can take the footy with you wherever you go. Off to walk the dog?
Take the footy!
Going camping?
Take the footy!
Picnic in the park?
Take the footy!
ABC Sport's expert coverage of the AFL
Incredible, Brad!
and the NRL. Every goal, try, mark and tackle, live and commercial free. So whatever you're up to, take the footy with you on the ABC Listener.
And Fraser will be back in half an hour. Your weather: Brisbane 26 and mostly sunny this Saturday. Sydney 32 and sunny for you. If you're in Canberra this Saturday, 25 and sunny. Melbourne 25 and sunny. Hobart bucking the trend, just 17 and showers for you. Adelaide 24 and sunny, partly cloudy in Perth and a top of 22. And in Darwin today, a sunny one, blue skies and a top temperature of 34. The news is next.
Good morning, Kerry Worthington with ABC News. A group of Indigenous former football players has launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse. The documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege that the AFL failed to protect players from and moved to stop violent racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to players. North Melbourne great Bill Cracker, who's leading the group of 7 players employed between 1975 and 2022, says they were deeply affected by the comments, and the AFL has the power to stop it from happening again. Finally, injury lawyers managing principal Michelle Martin says she expects more players to come forward.
The blue line racism has been swept under the carpet, and there has been this overwhelming culture within the AFL of silence. No longer do these players have to be silent. They have support and they can feel confident to come forward.
The AFL says it hasn't been served with any documents related. Workers in Libya's eastern city of Derna are continuing the difficult task of searching for bodies beneath the rubble and in the sea. ABC correspondent Noor Haider has more.
More than 11,300 people are known to have died in catastrophic flooding in eastern Libya caused by Storm Daniel, while thousands more are presumed dead. Emergency workers have been using thermal cameras and rescue dogs to look for signs of life under collapsed buildings as more bodies are retrieved from the sea. The World Health Organization and other aid groups are urging authorities not to bury victims in unmarked mass graves. According to the United Nations, more than 1,000 bodies have already been buried in that way.
The leaders of Australia, the US and the UK have reaffirmed their commitment to the AUKUS deal amid ongoing questions over how it'll be achieved. North America correspondent Jade McMillan reports.
In a statement to mark 2 years since AUKUS was first announced, Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak and Anthony Albanese described the plan for Australia to obtain nuclear-powered submarines as ambitious and aimed at deterring aggression in the Indo-Pacific. But legislation needed to progress the deal is being held up by Republicans in Congress, who argue the US needs to boost its own submarine production before selling them to Australia. The leaders insist they'll continue working with legislators in each country to bring the plan to fruition.
The Queensland Government says it's aiming to have extra rangers sent to K'gari, Fraser Island by the summer holidays to help prevent dingo attacks. There have been a high number of high-risk interactions between visitors and dingoes on the World Heritage listed island in recent months. Environment Minister Leanne Linnard says 10 new rangers will be recruited to boost safety and monitor dingo behaviour.
We'd like to see the additional staff on the island by the end of the year. Of course, we know one of the key visitation periods on K'gari is over the Christmas holidays, so we will absolutely be aiming to have those extra rangers on the ground for them.
The New South Wales Government has announced $260 million in the upcoming budget on infrastructure for electric vehicles. Sean Tarek Goodwin reports.
The New South Wales Government will spend $260 million on electric vehicle infrastructure, including publicly accessible fast chargers and upgraded grid capacity to support fleet vehicles. It says it'll focus on ensuring those in regional New South Wales, as well as renters and apartment owners, are able to access charging stations. But the government will also phase out rebates and stamp duty exemptions for electric vehicle owners from the start of next year, arguing those policies risk driving up the price of EVs.
Champion Olympic swimmer Ariane Titmus says she's recovering well after having 2 benign cysts removed from one of her ovaries this week. The Tasmanian-born 23-year-old posted on social media yesterday about the procedure and how the cysts were picked up during an MRI scan for a hip injury. Titmus told her followers how becoming a mother is her biggest dream, and the discovery of the cysts had caused her considerable concern. She's thanked her family and doctors and says she'll spend a few weeks recovering before returning to training. Hundreds of motorcycle enthusiasts and police officers across the country are taking part in today's annual wall-to-wall Ride for Remembrance. The event commemorates the service of fallen Australian police. The riders will meet at the National Police Memorial in Canberra. That's the latest ABC News. You can get news updates at abc.net.au/news or the ABC Listen app.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
With me, Chris Mitchell, a very good morning to you. Coming up this half hour.
I saw Libyan rescue teams. The real heroes are even the Boy Scouts who are huddled up in a small little room still digging in the mud. I saw a lot of patience also amongst the Libyans.
We'll get the latest from the flood-ravaged Libyan city of Derna to England, where a person has been killed in a dog attack, and a breakthrough in the fight against Alzheimer's. Hello, 9:35 in the east, 7:35 in the west. Hope you're well this Saturday morning. Some aid is beginning to arrive in eastern Libya after the devastating floods in which thousands of people have been killed. But there isn't much aid arriving, it's just a trickle. Political infighting between local officials in Derna and the international recognised government in Tripoli seem to be hampering the relief efforts. David Eastman is director of the International Medical Corps.
Our team entered Derna yesterday. Last night they met with Ministry of Health officials so that we could arrange medical care tomorrow with our medical team working with Ministry of Health health workers. We're rushing medicines in right now, and what they're seeing is, yes, there are dead bodies that are scattered, being cleaned. They described wreckage as if it was a war zone. He said that he saw a car on the 3rd floor of a house that was thrown up by the water. So the search and rescue effort is really over. At this point, it's cleanup, providing health services, mental health services, care for the survivors.
How are you moving medicine to that part of the country? Because I know the infrastructure has been seriously hit.
Well, International Medical Corps has been in Libya since 2011. We were the first international aid organization to enter and arrive in Libya when the conflict started in 2011. We've been there ever since. So we have strong relationships. Our team there is Libyan. They were able to procure medicines from Tripoli, where we had our office, and move them across to Benghazi, and then up. Now they're going to be moved to Benghazi and tomorrow to Ghana. So a local effort with a lot of professionalism from a decade of experience.
From a medical point of view, then, what kind of injuries or medical assistance most people needing right now?
Well, we're understanding from the Ministry of Health is that the cases of trauma have diminished. Now it's health care for the survivors that needs to continue. Obviously, a lot of people, as the report described, are traumatized. If you can imagine, the estimates of death are between 6,000 and 11,000 out of a population of about 90,000. That's at least 1 in 20 people that's died. So families are torn apart. Children are going to need support. They're seeing their families traumatized. So not only will healthcare be necessary in helping to rebuild the system, working with Ministry of Health, it's caring for those survivors, helping them to rebuild their lives.
Sanitation is a huge problem as well, and there are concerns about waterborne diseases. How worried are you right now about that?
Safe water is very important. We're looking at ways that we can help households to sanitize their water. And educating people and just basic approaches to that while they're in this situation that they never could have expected. Of course, the cleanup of the dead bodies will be important. The bodies that in and of themselves, let's say, aren't infectious, but the carrying and the handling of those bodies is hazardous. So it'll be important to make sure that any volunteers, any workers, are using safe procedures to protect themselves.
David Eastman, Director of the International Medical Corps, talking to CNN. A year ago, Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, died in the custody of Iran's morality police after being arrested 3 days prior for failing to wear her hijab correctly in Tehran. Her death sparked protests across the country, presenting one of the biggest challenges to clerical rule since the 1979 revolution. Tina Kordastrami is an Iranian activist and says although the story is not making daily headlines at the moment, it's still clamping down hard on those breaking the rules.
To be honest with you, the morality police themselves, they've never truly been removed from the streets. To this very day, we are seeing inhumane and, to be very honest, disgusting prosecutions taking place day to day with our Iranian youth.
Have you noticed, though, Tina, since the death, and it's the year anniversary now, that there has been a change in the pushback against morality police? Because from what I'm reading, that there are a cohort of people who aren't wearing their hijabs, who are pushing back against the control on women.
Absolutely. The strength that these women have within Iran to leave their homes and, not wear a hijab or wear it loosely, it's incredible. But to be fair and honest with you, the prosecutions are still taking place, deaths are still taking place. And the women are not safe, and as we are seeing today, the restrictions are becoming harsher.
This was, a pretty big challenge, and maybe the strongest for some time to the Iranian regime. I think it's about 25 protesters been sentenced to death, around 7 hanged. Do you think the response has been harsher because of the threat potentially posed by this?
To be honest, the statistics are much higher than that.
Right.
There are a lot more deaths taking place in Iran, a lot more executions as well. The restrictions are becoming harsher because the Iranian diaspora has been inspired to speak their truth as a result of Mahsa Amini's death. And this has, invited many Western governments to place pressure upon Iran.
Well, let's look at some of that pressure. We know that Australia has slapped a fresh wave of sanctions on Iranian officials. Joe Biden, the US president, spoke overnight saying Mahsa's story did not end with her brutal death. She inspired an historic movement, women, life, freedom, that has impacted Iran and influenced people across the globe. Are Western democracies and governments doing enough?
No.
What more would you like them to be doing?
We would like to see a lot more than just sanctions. We would like to see ties cut. We would like to see relationships cut with Iran. We are dealing with a brutal dictatorship here. We are dealing with a very dangerous regime who has a military group which sends operatives all over the globe.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that because the Iranian diaspora, as you said, on social media and other things, has raised a lot of awareness about this. You've spoken about being followed, I think, here in Australia. There are reports of other critics elsewhere in the world being followed as well and targeted. Do you think that the treatment of the diaspora in Australia should be a bigger issue, a bigger focus for the government? Or is this something you think they're already looking at?
It absolutely should be. The Australian government has only placed a few sanctions upon Iran and showed little to no support to Iranian Australian community themselves, even though we're tax-paying citizens and we deserve the same treatment towards our national security and support provided. I myself have been harassed, abused, followed, threatened. This is nothing in comparison to many other stories, except a lot of people in our community do not feel safe enough to speak their truth. It's putting your family in Iran at risk, but also within Australia itself, as we do not trust that we are looked after by our governments in a way we should be. We do not feel safe to speak up about our experiences.
Given that, how will your community be marking today, the one-year event, the death of Mahsa Amini?
We hope to see unity today. We have worked so hard over the last year advocating for change within Iran. We have formed so many ties within the Australian government, the Australian public as well. And as a community, we have become stronger. And so today we expect to see unity on the streets, within Hyde Park, within Town Hall. Wherever there is a rally today, we want unity because we know together we are stronger. In Iran itself, we cannot have that expectation of the people to come out onto the streets, as the prosecutions they will face are unfathomable. But we do hope that they feel empowered enough to do so.
You're listening to ABC News Radio this Saturday morning to a potentially exciting development in Alzheimer's research now. Scientists have known for a while that people with the disease see a build-up of proteins in the brain. They're called amyloid and tau. They also know the disease involves brain cells dying, but they've been unsure what the link is, or more accurately, how it works. But now researchers in Britain and Belgium think they've worked it out. Sian Gregory is a research communications manager at the Alzheimer's Society.
So in Alzheimer's disease, we've got a really complicated set of causes that we're seeing. So there are proteins building up in the brain that we think are toxic and are causing damage to the brain cells and causing the brain cells to not work properly, and then ultimately those brain cells die, which leads to the symptoms of dementia that we see. What we haven't understood for a long time is that we've known the processes that are causing Alzheimer's disease, but we've not known exactly how. It's Alzheimer's Society research which first showed that over 30 years ago, that a protein called amyloid builds up in the brain. We've not known how it causes the disease, and so understanding how the brain cells die is really important, and that's what you've just described. We've seen with this research showing this new type of cell death that is implicated in Alzheimer's disease that's causing this damage in the brain, and it's really, really something that researchers can now take forward and explore further.
How important is that discovery for the drug companies who are researching the treatments for Alzheimer's?
It's incredibly important because understanding what's going wrong in the brain and what exactly is happening is at the absolute foundation of dementia research and Alzheimer's disease research. Without knowing what's going wrong, we can't design new treatments to try and fix it. And so this is very early stages. This research is really laying the foundation for what comes next. But the hope is that we'll be able to take this research forward and try and identify new targets, new things to target with drugs, that we can then develop new treatments for Alzheimer's disease in the future.
And it would be a different drug regime, because we've just, in recent months, we've reported about new treatments coming online for Alzheimer's, but this would be targeting, well, it would be a blocker, would it, for those chemicals that are killing the neurons?
Potentially, yeah. So we've seen great success in other conditions like cancer where you have combination treatments and combination therapies, and we think that's the way that Alzheimer's disease treatments are going. We know there's a very complicated set of causes, lots of things that are causing the disease to happen, and therefore we need lots of different treatments to target those different causes. And so this is really promising because it's adding to what we can target with future treatments as they're developed.
Sean Gregory from the Alzheimer's Society on that breakthrough. Let's get a check on the newspapers now. Holger Brockman's back and he starts with the Sydney Herald and Telegraph.
EV subsidy on the budget scrapping, according to the Sydney Morning Herald paper edition. New South Wales Treasurer Daniel Mookhey will scrap a $3,000 subsidy for drivers who buy a new electric vehicle, but will redirect some of the savings to rolling out more charging stations. In a significant shift to the state's electric vehicle policy, the New South Wales Labor government will announce in Tuesday's state budget that it will end rebates for EV purchases and stamp duty exemptions from January 1, saving $527 million. Instead, the government will pump $260 million into EV infrastructure for drivers in regional New South Wales, renters and people who live in apartments, and motorists who do not have access to home charging. Mookhey also gave the strongest indication to date that the government does not intend to cancel the $25 billion Metro West rail line. The electronic version of the Herald says, Yes launches a $20 million ad blitz. The Minister for Indigenous Australians has discussed facing unbelievably racist bullying as the opposition leader Peter Dutton sowed confusion over a second referendum. The Saturday Telegraph paper edition. Kyle and Jackie O's record contract demand a $200 million deal. Show them the money. That's the message from Sydney radio king and queen Kyle Sandilands and Jackie O. They are chasing a massive $200 million joint deal to remain at their current radio home, KISS, for another 10 years. The duo have each set their monster $10 million a year asking price with the expectation it'll take them through to the end of 2034, when one or both will retire from radio. The mooted new contract dwarfs the pair's current $5 million a year deal, plus revenue incentives expected to bring it up to another $1 million. Online it reports a hot summer ahead has fire authorities concerned, but the Rural Fire Service has high hopes for Big Red, a new Chinook aircraft that can carry 10 times the load of other choppers. It says Sydney is set to swelter through temperatures in the mid-30s next week, peaking at 36 in Penrith on Wednesday. The fire danger rating today will be raised to high. The Canberra Times writes the Department of Agriculture, Forestries and Fisheries has been urged to improve. It is perceived as very transactional, reactive and not actively engaged in whole-of-government priorities. An independent review of the agency has found.
Thank you, Holger. The UK Prime Minister says he'll ban the American Bully XL dog breed by the end of the year. Rishi Sunak made the announcement after a man was killed in an attack by two of the animals. Earlier, another attack on an 11-year-old girl sparked debate about banning certain dog breeds. Last year there were nearly 22,000 cases of out-of-control dogs causing injury in the UK. It was up just over 16,000 in 2018. But lawyer Simon Spence says that banning certain breeds is a difficult legal proposition.
Not least because, of course, the particular breed in question, the American XL Bully, isn't a breed, it's a crossbreed. And many owners who want to try and avoid responsibility for their dog's actions will seek to argue, well, it's not actually an American XL Bully. And that will involve expert evidence, challenges in courts, and I think the whole situation could get very complicated indeed, simply by proving whether the dog is a banned dog or not.
So let's go back to this point about the breed and the crossbreed. What's going on here with that? I mean, is that causing some kind of aggression, or because you're saying that dogs aren't necessarily born to sort of attack, and yet here we are with the situation with this particular dog?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm no expert on dog breeding. I'm just a lawyer, but I do think the government needs to take a step back and take expert advice on the breed that they are looking at the moment, in the way I think they did do with pit bull terriers and so forth, to find out whether these dogs are genetically and generically aggressive, or whether in fact the aggression that they've displayed clearly very significantly over the last few days and months is as a result of the way they're being kept and bred and trained. And I think more focus perhaps need to be focused on the owners and breeders rather than on the dogs themselves, because not every...
I mean, given you've dealt with cases to do with, or a case to do with a dog bite, in your view, do you think that this kind of law can be implemented properly?
It's going to be very difficult to enforce, and the real issue is whether it's going to solve the problem. Because people who currently have American XL bullies, for whatever reason, if their purpose is to cause difficulties within their neighbourhoods by breeding aggressive dogs, if they can't have an American XL bully, they will simply move on to another large breed of dog. And I think, whilst I understand the government's reaction to what happened yesterday, which is truly appalling, they just need to think about what the root cause of the problem is. And I'm not sure the root cause of the problem is the breed of dog. I think it's the way that the dog is actually being brought up, looked after. Because I'm sure many dogs of this breed who are looked after by responsible owners are perfectly good pets and present no threat to anybody.
And I suppose the other complication is, what do you do about the people who currently have them? You know, it's not just about potentially putting a law in place and banning them going forward. But as you say, it sort of opens a can of worms in terms of breeders, owners, and the people who currently have these dogs.
It does. And of course, what we have to bear in mind is that the current Dangerous Dogs Act deals not only with dogs in public, but it also deals with dogs in people's own homes. So, and this was a significant change in the law a few years ago, whereby visitors to a house are protected by the Dangerous Dogs Act from a dog in a property. So the case I was involved with, for example, was a postal worker who was bitten when he was putting the post through the letterbox. And so it's not just attacks on people in public. And I think we just need to take a step back and look at what the law actually says at the moment. Because occasionally the government does say, well, we need to change the law because it's not covered. But it is, because if somebody allows their dog to behave dangerously out of control in public, and they are being grossly negligent in allowing that to happen, and if, as happened sadly yesterday, somebody loses their life, potentially the dog owner will be prosecuted for manslaughter, because gross negligence is a cause of manslaughter, which can be punished with life imprisonment, and that's far more serious than any of the sentences under the Dangerous Dogs Act.
Right, it's 5 to 10 in the east, 5 to 8 in the west. It's time to say good morning once again to Fraser.
Good morning, Chris. In the AFL, Carlton is into a preliminary final after defeating Melbourne by 2 points at the MCG. ABC Sports' Corbin Middlemass reports.
Melbourne led by 9 points heading into time on in the final term as Jesse Motlop bobbed up to kick a goal to bring the Blues within 3 points. 9 minutes later, Blake Acres made himself the hero, scoring the go-ahead goal with 56 seconds remaining. The Blues got the crucial centre break and scored another behind to make the final margin 2 and book a spot in the final 4 for the first time in 23 years. The Demons exit the finals race in straight sets for the second straight year, while Carlton will play Brisbane in a preliminary final next weekend. Corbin Middlemass, ABC Sport, Melbourne.
In the AFLW, North Melbourne has beaten Geelong by 9 points in their round 3 match at Cardinia Park. 4 goals, 7-31 to 3-4-22. The Cats were up by 17 points at half-time, but the Kangaroos hit back and dominated the second half. North Melbourne has started the season with 3 wins in a row, while Geelong has 2 wins and a loss. And a group of Indigenous former football players have launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse. Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and moved to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to players. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker, who is leading the group of 7 players employed between 1975 and 2022, says they were deeply affected by the comments and the AFL has the power to stop it ever happening again. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says she expects more players to come forward.
For too long, racial vilification has been swept under the carpet, and there has been this overwhelming culture within the AFL of silence. No longer do these players have to be silent. They have support and they can feel confident to come forward.
In a statement, the AFL says it has not been served with any documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it. Shifting to the NRL, in a 79th minute try by Will Warbrick has secured the Storm an 18 points to 13 victory over the Sydney Roosters in their semi-final at Melbourne's Rectangular Stadium. The Roosters led 13-12 when Warbrick scored to send the Storm into a preliminary final. Roosters 5'8" Luke Keary has told ABC Sport it's a tough way to be knocked out of the finals.
Well, we had that there at the end. That's typified us this year. It's been ugly, but we've fought so hard, so close as a group. I'm so proud of these boys. Couldn't have asked for any more effort.
The Storm will take on the Penrith Panthers next Friday for a spot in the grand final. And South Africa has defeated Australia's men's cricket team by 164 runs in the 4th match of their 5-match ODI series in Centurion. Heinrich Klaassen earned Player of the Match honours with 174 runs as the host set a target of 5 for 416. Australia was all out for 252, with opener Travis Head retiring hurt due to a fractured hand. The result levels the series at 2-2 ahead of the final ODI in Johannesburg on Sunday. Swedish duo Ludvig Åberg and Sebastian Soderberg hold a lead after 2 rounds of golf's PGA Championship in England. The pair sit at 10 under for the tournament, with Englishman Tommy Fleetwood a shot back in 3rd. World number 2 Rory McIlroy barely made the cut, finishing with a birdie on the 18th to end the day at 1 under. Minwoo Lee is the best placed Australian, tied for 16th at 6 under. And in basketball, Adelaide 36ers import Trey Kell will not play in the upcoming NBL Blitz pre-season tournament due to a left knee injury. The Blitz competition begins today on the Gold Coast and runs until next Friday. And that is the latest in sport. Chris?
Thank you very much, Fraser. Speak to you again soon. You're listening to ABC News Radio. Quick look at your weather. Brisbane 26 and mostly sunny today. Sydney hot, 32 and sunny. Canberra, pretty warm as well, sunny and 25 for you today. In Melbourne, you'll also reach 25 and a sunny day ahead. Hobart, just 17 for you and showers. Adelaide, 24 and sunny. In Perth, 22 and a partly cloudy day. While in Darwin, you can expect a top temperature of 34 and blue skies. The news is next.
You just want your news sharp, thorough and on the go. The ABC News Daily Podcast helps you understand the issues affecting your world. ABC journalists and industry experts bring you one story each episode, in depth, in less than 15 minutes. From the housing market to net zero, the cost of living to interest rates. For coverage you can trust about the issues that matter to you, plug into ABC News Daily on the ABC Listen app.
Held hostage, according to French President Emmanuel Macron. He's accused of
Good morning, Kerry Worthington with ABC News. A group of Indigenous former football players hope a class action they've launched against the AFL for alleged racist abuse will stamp out the behaviour for good. Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and move to stop racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to players. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker, who's leading the group of 7 players employed between 1975 and 2022, says racism has been swept under the carpet for too long and the AFL has the power to stop it ever happening again. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says the players have suffered significantly.
It was incredibly traumatic and stands out as a pivotal and life-changing event for them. It's changed the trajectory of many of their lives and has meant that they've lived and continue to live with the trauma of those incidents.
International aid agencies are yet to arrive in force in the devastated Libyan coastal city of Derna. Heavy rain saw 2 dams collapse in the city, killing more than 11,000 people. Another 10,000 remain unaccounted. A senior analyst at the International Crisis Group in Derna says civilians are leading the rescue effort.
I saw Libyan rescue teams. The real heroes are even the Boy Scouts, who are huddled up in a small little room still digging in the mud. I saw a lot of patience also amongst the Libyans helping with the aid effort. So I saw a city and a country trying to come together and overcome this tragedy.
French President Emmanuel Macron says the country's diplomatic standoff in Niger are being held hostage inside the French embassy. The BBC's Ian McWilliam has the details.
Mr. Macron told journalists that Ambassador Sylvain Ité was literally being held hostage in the French embassy in the capital Niamey. He said the military junta was blocking deliveries of food and would not allow the ambassador to go out. Mr. Macron said Paris would act in agreement with Mohamed Bazoum, the deposed president, who's still being detained in the country. Paris considers Mr. Bazoum the legitimate head of state. Niger's military leaders have also told France to withdraw its force of 1,500 soldiers. President Macron has already said that any redeployment will be decided together with Mr. Bazoum.
US President Joe Biden is backing striking auto workers after they walked off the job at 3 factories. All 3 of the big US car makers have been hit with a strike at the same time for the first time in 88 years. Mr. Biden says the profits of the major motor manufacturers aren't being shared fairly. The Democratic Senator for Michigan, Debbie Stabenow, says the workers deserve to be rewarded for the sacrifices they made during an industry crisis in 2009.
The workers took major sacrifices at that time. No more retiree health care since 2007, lower wages, and more tiers. And they want to be made whole, and they should be. And when we see the great new products being produced, they need to also be sharing in this success.
WA's Shadow Minister for Police, Peter Collier, says it's concerning that people being recruited to fill labour shortages are struggling to get visas due to their children's disabilities. Experienced UK-based police officer Jonathan Wales was accepted into the WA police force through the latest state government recruitment drive. He's since withdrawn his application after discovering he's unlikely to get visa approval because his 4-year-old son has autism. Mr. Collier says the government should be doing everything it can to attract and retain experienced officers, considering the record attrition rates.
Surely we can have a little bit of flexibility with regard to our visa applicants to ensure that we can fill the gaps and also, as a 21st century society, care for a child with autism. To me, it is a no-brainer.
The police minister has declined to comment. In the NRL, Newcastle fans say they'll embrace being in enemy territory when the Knights face New Zealand in front of a sellout crowd at Auckland this afternoon. The Knights go into the semi-final clash as underdogs. Newcastle supporter Dylan Watkins says he's booked his tickets after they beat Canberra last Sunday.
Because I love the team and I love the NRL, big NRL fan as well. And I've never done a game in New Zealand for the night. It's going to be a lot of fun. Here to cheer the boys on.
In the AFL, Carlton scored a thrilling 2-point victory over Melbourne in last night's semi-final at the MCG. The Blues kicked a goal to take the lead with 1 minute to play, winning 11-7-73 to 9-17-71. The second semi-final is tonight between Port Adelaide and GWS Giants at Adelaide Oval. And you're up to date with the latest from ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio with me, Chris Mitchell. Coming up this half hour.
We don't know the extent of the problem. The floods and the torrents and the destroyed buildings and the sludge still conceal the level of need and death, and then sustaining in that second phase, getting the right aid to the right people at the right time. That's where coordination is so important.
With thousands missing and thousands dead, Libya still waiting for aid. And in China, a key politician hasn't been seen for days. Where is the country's defence minister? Good morning to you. 10:05 in the east, 5:08 in the west. Also this half hour we'll hear from the disability advocate Hannah Diviney. Martin Griffith says the disaster is a massive reminder of climate change and the challenges it poses. Over 11,000 people have lost their lives in Derna, but thousands are still missing, and the city's mayor says the total could reach 20,000 people. Survivors there have described terrifying escapes and people being swept away in front of their eyes. Entire neighbourhoods were taken away when two dams collapsed by a torrent of water. Jan Egeland is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council.
It's just beyond belief, really. This is one of these catastrophes that just gets worse and worse by the day. The hurricanes and floods are in most of the northern and western societies not costing a lot of lives because we're well prepared. There is evacuation. There is some societal preparedness. In this case, the breakage of the dams meant that 30 million cubic meters of water burst into a town without warning, and it killed too many thousands.
We do see flooding and hurricanes in the Western world, as you've just said, but not these sorts of horrific numbers where there are fears of up to 20,000 dead. And of course, again, it comes down to the political divisions within this country.
Let's hope that this enormous calamity, of course the hurricane swept across all of the coast, east to west, but it's really the epicenter is in and around Derna, but it should lead to the east and the west, and the political authorities now saying we have a common enemy here. Let us build together, let's cooperate, let us give visas to these international organizations that struggle to send the teams to the place. It really held us back, the political conflict, in helping the Libyan people. We hope that will change now. Remember, it's been war here, or conflict on and off, since Gaddafi fell with NATO bombing in 2011, and Derna was very badly hit by infighting just a few years back.
Just tell us what your teams are doing on the ground and what are the most urgent needs.
We have more than 100 aid workers in Libya, half of them in the east, in and around Benghazi. They have had big problems deploying to the worst hit areas because when we need the roads and the bridges and so on, of course, they swept away. They are there now, they're doing assessment. We will provide to 500 families now emergency kits that they need for survival when their homes are gone. Then we will give assistance to the collective centers that are now filling up with families from these areas. Tens of thousands of families are affected, and they need, among other things, cash assistance because they lost everything. So we're urging donor countries, the public sector, the private individuals to help us help these people in their hour of greatest need. Libya has been very underfunding our aid work there now for years, including the work for the migrants that are also trapped in all of this in Libya.
Russia is learning as well. Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, talking to the BBC. The Italian island of Lampedusa has seen an influx of migrants, with 7,000 people arriving in 2 days, prompting its mayor and the United Nations Refugee Agency to warn the island is becoming overwhelmed. Lampedusa, whose population is actually under 7,000, has long been a first port of call for people crossing from North Africa. It's been a flashpoint in Europe's migration crisis. Many of the latest arrivals have fled political instability in Tunisia. Gerald Naus is a former advisor to the German government on migration and now works for the European Stability Initiative. He's been talking to our broadcast partners, Deutsche Welle.
The bigger context is that nothing the EU has done, nothing that Italy has done in the last few years has really worked. What we are seeing is a record number of people crossing the central Mediterranean. If this trend continues, it will be more people this year than in the record year 2016. We are seeing that the attempts to stop rescue boats, NGO rescue boats, completely missed the point. These people are now arriving with their boats directly in Italy. They don't need to be rescued. We've also seen that the migration agreement that was reached by Italy and the European Commission President a few weeks ago has actually made things worse. More people have left Tunisia since the agreement, and human rights violations in Tunisia have actually intensified, which means that more sub-Saharan Africans had an interest to try to flee with smugglers to Europe. So current EU strategy is not working, and it would be very good to finally have a realistic and serious debate on what might work.
Tell me more about German strategy. That's where you've worked in an advisory role. Germany recently stopped accepting migrants arriving in Italy under that European solidarity plan. Where is the solidarity in that?
The Russians are just over there. We are now.
I mean, this is one of these red herrings, one of these totally meaningless debates. Germany last year.
Why is that meaningless?
Because solidarity will not be increased by transferring 1,000 people from Italy to Germany, when last year Italy gave protection to 25,000 people and Germany gave protection to 150,000 people. People distribute themselves. If Italy takes the people from Lampedusa to Italy, they will not stay in Italy. Everyone knows that. And what we've been seeing in these debates on distributing asylum seekers or distributing refugees, if you actually have a system that would be fair and distribute them according to some indicators, in most years in the last decade, people would have been taken from the north of Europe to the south.
Okay, so you say the system.
Than France.
You say the system's broken, basically, but the system at the moment is
broken and will not
it's waving people through from countries like Italy and Greece, isn't it?
Which can cut our signal.
Right. Anybody can leave Italy to go to Switzerland, France, or Germany. The idea that France will stop them at the border, and again, this is pure populism. France has had border controls with Italy since 2015 November. In the 4 years after they introduced border controls on the land border, which is 300 kilometers, in those 4 years of border controls, the number of asylum applications in France doubled. The border controls didn't work inside the EU either. So let's have a serious debate. People who reach Italy will not stay in Italy, and they will not be stopped by some token controls on the German or French border. What we need is a way to stop people getting into these boats that doesn't rely on immoral deals with Libya or Tunisia, and the only way to do that is to have partners, safe countries on the other side of the Mediterranean, to whom people can be taken so that they have no incentive to get into the boats, but that their asylum claims, if they claim asylum, can still be processed. And that requires serious offers to countries to have an interest to cooperate.
Right, from Italy to China now. Trying to work out what is going on in the heart of the Chinese government is pretty tough because the administration at the very top in Beijing is not just authoritarian, it's also opaque. So not surprisingly, there's quite a lot of interest over the country's defense minister, Li Shengfu, who's not been seen in public now for more than 2 weeks. Danny Russell is Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and also served as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs under the former US President Barack Obama.
We don't know for certain, but the rumors are circulating widely in China, now spilling across China's border, that Li Shengfu has been purged. And coming on the heels of the still unexplained removal of the foreign minister, Qin Gang, as well as the purge of the 2 top officers in the elite military so-called rocket force, which was Xi Jinping's own pet project, it certainly feels like something is going on.
Are there any sort of rumors as to, if this is the case, in what way Li Shangfu has fallen foul of Xi Jinping?
The speculation is that Li has been implicated in a widespread corruption case involving military procurement. Now, corruption is, as they say, not a bug, it's a feature of the Chinese system. Corruption, notwithstanding Xi Jinping's much vaunted anti-corruption campaign, is rampant throughout the Chinese system. And when you're talking about throwing tens of billions of dollars at projects the way that Xi Jinping has it with his aggressive military modernization campaign, the opportunities for senior officials who are also all too human, the opportunities for corruption are pretty unlimited. If it is in fact the case that he has been removed, it is hugely important for two big reasons, Tim. One is that in the Chinese system, Li Shangfu and Qin Gang are not merely ministers. They are two of the four so-called state councilors, which is a significantly higher position in the pantheon of national leaders in the People's Republic of China. And secondly, each of these two men were handpicked by Xi Jinping himself at the pinnacle of his power following the 20th Party Congress, where he got an unprecedented third term. In the case of the foreign minister, Qin Gang, Xi Jinping leapfrogged him over far more qualified, more traditional candidates. So we're at a point now where there is no one for Xi Jinping to blame for what would be a serious failure of judgment. Look, if you're in charge of everything, at some point, ultimately, you're going to be responsible for all the things that go wrong.
That's a really interesting reading. I just wonder what you make of the sort of the public trolling of the Chinese administration by the current US ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, who tweeted that what's going on in Beijing now resembles Agatha Christie's novel, and then there were none, under the hashtag Mystery in Beijing building. Do you think is appropriate?
The non-career ambassadors can be unconventional in certain respects. Certainly, speaking or denouncing a third country when you're representing the United States in a different country is not part of the curriculum in training American diplomats. But there are trade-offs, and the American ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, brings phenomenal talents and great intellect to the job, so I'm prepared to let this pass.
Let me bring you back home now on ABC News Radio to Hannah Diviney. She's a force for change. The 23-year-old disability advocate made the headlines last year for calling out Beyonce, among others, and her lyrics, which she described as ableist. She listened, Beyonce that is, and made changes. Now Hannah has written her first book. It's called I'll Let Myself In.
Pretty much the only two narratives of disability that I grew up with were the Paralympics every 4 years or road safety ads. And for me, even though I love watching sport, playing sport was not something that I was super interested in or passionate about, and I really took issue with the fact that my younger able-bodied sisters were able to do whatever they wanted and not have to answer the question of what's your Olympic sport going to be every 5 seconds, unlike me. So yeah, I created this path instead.
Was there a moment in your life that you knew you were different?
Yeah, so I was about 3. I was at daycare, and my best friend at the time stood up after finishing lunch and ran off to go and play, and I finished my lunch and wanted to go follow her, and then kind of got really confused because obviously nothing happened, and I was like, hold on a minute, that doesn't seem right. So I really concentrated on it, and then again obviously nothing happened, and it hadn't really occurred to me before then that I'd needed help to get into that chair in the first place, or that I was one of the only ones who needed help getting out of bed at nap time. So I went home and did what all 3-year-olds do and asked my parents, because I was like, what's going on? Why am I different? Like, what's what's happening? And they kind of started to explain that I have cerebral palsy and it's not going to go away, and it's something that means that my brain and my legs, like, specifically don't communicate very well. That was how they explained it to a 3-year-old. Obviously, my understanding of it is far more nuanced now. But yeah, that was the first time.
And how did you then grow into the knowledge that you were living with a disability? How did you come to terms with it, and how did you think, well, this is what's happening and I'm going to make the best of my life, which you've clearly done and exceeded?
I think it's a lifelong process, and to be quite honest, it's still ongoing. Like, there will definitely be days even now where I'm like, man, it would be really great if I just got a break from this, or if, like, there was one extra thing I could do by myself, because, you know, I can't get out of bed, or I can't get dressed, and like, most of the time that's fine. Sometimes it rubs. But yeah, I think it's just about learning to value what I was good at, and that has been a really tough process, because a lot of the time the people around me were doing different things, and it's hard not to compare yourself to other people. I think we're all prone to that sometimes. But yeah, it's been a slow process, but I think I'm really lucky to have had some people around me who have helped me to see the value that I bring to the world.
And Hannah, you own a unique record. I think I'm right in saying you're the first person to have been involved, who is disabled to be involved in a sex scene on television. How does that come about?
You can say it the other way.
You can say it the other way.
Only Glendale brings these sorts of things up, right? Yeah.
I wanted to ask.
Well, that comes up completely by accident, is how that comes up. So I often get approached because of my advocacy with all sorts of cool emails and opportunities, and I had this email from a producer who was working with SBS on this show called Latecomers, and he was like, hey, do you want to just come and read for this character? This doesn't mean you're going to be involved in the show, but we just need someone who can come and, like, read the lines out loud so that the writers can work out if what they've actually written down makes sense for human beings to say, and for characters to think, and all of that kind of stuff. So I went and did that, had a fabulous time, and then the director and the head of casting both came up to me and they were like, so, you're auditioning for the show? And they phrased it as a statement, not a question, and I went, I am? And they were like, yep, we expect to see your audition tape. And I was like, cool, how do I do one of those? Like, what's that? And then obviously, like, doing the sex scene was a huge thing to have done. It's not a piece of history I thought I would ever know. It's definitely a unique piece of history, and I think my future grandkids will have lots of questions. But I'm really glad that I got to be the one to do it, but at the same time, it's frustrating that it's taken until 2022 for us to see disability and intimacy in relationships in that way on screen.
Creating those images and people that you never saw when you were growing up. I mean, you've got many feathers to your bow, actor, as we just, you're an editor-in-chief of Missing Perspectives.
Yes.
You're a book, Now I'll Let Myself In. What was your intention with I'll Let Myself In? What did you want to achieve in writing it?
So I've wanted to be a writer since I was 4, and I always thought that I would write fiction first, and then kind of this little voice in the back of my brain was like, I think you need to own your own story before you go telling other people's. And then it just sort of became this place where I could write down all of the things that I wished I'd had along the way growing up, and kind of taking ownership of all of the things that have happened to me and all of the things that being disabled means, and trying to sort of dispel some of the shame and confusion and sort of just inner chaos that comes from that sort of thing.
Hannah Diviney talking about her first book, I'll Let Myself In. You're with us here on ABC News Radio this Saturday morning. Time to get the latest sport, and welcome Fraser back.
Thanks, Chris. Melbourne AFL coach Simon Goodwin says the team will build on adversity following their season-ending 2-point loss to Carlton at the MCG. The Demons bow out of the finals with successive defeats for the second straight year, despite top four finishes in both seasons. They've now lost 4 straight finals at the MCG since their drought-breaking 2021 premiership win in Perth. Goodwin says despite the disappointment, they've progressed as a footy club.
I think we're in a good shape to be able to continue to build, but we've got to sometimes go through these little challenges, this adversity, to really build the resilience and greatness that's required to win big games. And this is just for us, another step in our little workway that we want to go back to where we want to be.
A group of Indigenous former football players have launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse, Yvette Gray reports.
North Melbourne great Phil Cracker is among the group of 7 taking the action, alleging the AFL failed to protect players from and move to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to the players. Documents lodged in the Supreme Court yesterday allege the AFL knew or ought to have known of the immediate and long-term adverse consequences of experiencing racial vilification, both physical and verbal, on the players. Cracker says racism has been swept under the carpet for too long and the AFL has the power to stop it ever happening again. Marga lip injury lawyers say the players were employed between 1975 and 2022.
And in a statement, the AFL says it has not been served with any documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it. The Melbourne Stormers scored a late try to beat the Sydney Roosters in their NRL semi-final in Melbourne. ABC Sports' Andrew Moore reports.
Melbourne was off to a flying start, leading 10 points to nil 26 minutes into the game, but the Roosters had momentum going into half-time after Brandon Smith scored against his old team. 10-6 Melbourne, then 12-6 with a penalty goal, but Lindsay Collins scored in the 66th minute to level the scores at 12, and the Roosters looked like winners when Sam Walker kicked a late field goal. But on a last play Hail Mary kick from Cam Munster, Will Warbrick, the Melbourne winger, flew above the pack and grabbed the ball and managed to score a try that had Melbourne winning 18-13 and setting up a preliminary final in Sydney next week against the Penrith Panthers. Andrew Moore, ABC Sport, Melbourne.
And Newcastle prop Daniel Saifiti has been ruled out at this afternoon's semi-final clash against the Warriors with a hamstring injury. Brodie Jones will come onto the bench while the rest of the team remains unchanged. Well, Travis Head's Cricket World Cup is in doubt after he suffered a fractured hand during Australia's 164-run ODI loss to South Africa in Centurion. The opener suffered the blow to his left hand off a Gerald Coetzee delivery, which saw the 29-year-old retire hurt. Chasing 417 for victory, the visitors could only muster 252 in reply. Australian captain Mitch Marsh says sometimes you just get outplayed.
Yeah, if you look at the history of this ground, teams have been able to make it up in the back 20. I think they scored 270 in the last 20 overs, which is incredible. We were certainly put under a lot of pressure towards the back end there, and sometimes in in-touch cricket, you got to give your hats off to guys who, Hundrick had an amazing day today, and hats off to him.
The series is level at 2-2 with the final ODI to be played in Johannesburg on Sunday. And cyclist Alberto Danese has narrowly avoided a crash to sprint to victory in stage 19 of the Vuelta in Spain. A touching of wheels saw several riders fall just over 2 kilometres from the finish, with the Italian inching out fellow countryman Filippo Ganna. American Sepp Kuss finished outside the top 50 but maintains a lead over the rest of the field. And that is the latest in sport. Chris?
Thanks very much, Fraser. Speak to you again soon. The weather for you today: Brisbane 26 and mostly sunny. This Saturday in Sydney, warm 32 and sunny for you too. Canberra 25 and sunny. Melbourne 25 and sunny also. In Hobart 17 and showers. Adelaide 24 and sunny, partly cloudy in Perth and 22, and in Darwin 34 and sunny. The weather, the news is next.
Why get your news from the ABC News app?
Well, it's part of my daily routine. I check it on my phone, then I stop for a break.
I can focus on local, national, or world news. It's my choice.
I get an alert when something new comes in.
Love the live blogs. Follow them all day.
There's more than just headline stories, you know.
It's news that makes a difference.
Why do I get my news from the ABC News app?
I trust it.
I trust ABC News Online.
And it's free.
It's free.
For free news you can trust, download the ABC News app.
Good morning, Kerry Worthington with ABC News. Libyan authorities have denied claims that many victims who were killed in devastating floods in the eastern city of Derna were ordered not to evacuate, as the death toll passes 11,000. There are reports the military told residents to shelter in their homes, but Othman Abdul Jalil, a top official in Libya's eastern government, says that's not true.
What happened in Derna, because when we came, the military was there, and they said we tried to announce to people, please leave your homes. Now, a lot of them did it, but unfortunately, people sometimes they say, well, this is exaggerating. So there are no instructions asking people to remain in their homes.
The European Commission has announced it will lift a ban on importing Ukrainian grain to its member states. However, Poland, Hungary and Slovakia say they'll extend restrictions, arguing it'll affect their farmers. The BBC's Sarah Rainsford reports.
It's election season in Poland, and the ruling party is relying on rural votes to secure a win and stay in power. So, on the campaign trail, the Prime Minister told a rally that he would act in farmers' interests, overrule the European Commission and keep Poland's border shut to Ukrainian grain. Slovakia and Hungary will foresaw a political popular Russian invasion. There's many months of strong support from Poland for Ukraine since the Russian invasion.
One of Australia's showbiz power couples is calling it quits, with Hugh Jackman and Deborah Lee Furness separating. Here's North America correspondent Carrington Clark.
After almost 3 decades together, the two actors have told People magazine in the United States that they've decided to separate. They first met back in 1995 when they co-starred on an ABC TV show called Corelli. Since then, Jackman has become a Hollywood powerhouse, including starring as Wolverine in the X-Men series. Furness has become a high-profile advocate for overseas adoption. In recent years, the couple have split their time mostly between the United States and Australia. They ask for their privacy to be respected at this time.
A UK-based police officer who was accepted into the WA force says there's no prospect of moving his family to Australia because his son has autism. The ABC's spoken to several families who have children with disabilities facing barriers to entering the country for permanent residency. Jonathan Wales is an experienced police officer and was invited to apply to the WA Police through new state government recruitment drives. But he says it's highly unlikely their visas will be approved.
You're almost saying, he's not good enough, which is completely unfair. I think as a family we're going to absolutely contribute far more than what we would take out.
The head of forensic science, South Australia, says what he calls an unfortunate incident involving human remains at the centre's building was an isolated occurrence, but further highlights the urgent need for new facilities. Bethany Alderson has more, and a warning this report has some graphic content.
Forensic Science SA says blood and fluid from a corpse seeped through the mortuary floor into the ceiling space below and onto a worker's desk in a basement office. The incident happened in 2021 at the centre's headquarters, which are housed in a 40-year-old building in Adelaide CBD. Director John Doherty says it's just one example cited in a business case for a new facility.
Although the incidents are quite confronting and unfortunate, it's actually quite pleasing that government have recognised the state of the facility.
The SA government committed $349 million in the state budget to build a new centre. Renewal SA is currently searching for a location.
A senior bushfire researcher in the Northern Territory says climate change is affecting fire seasons. A fire to the east of Tennant Creek burnt through more than 10 million hectares over the past week. The Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research's senior researcher, Dr. Andrew Edwards, says the impact of climate change is tangible.
That window of opportunity to do the prescribed burning is getting smaller because we're getting more extremes of hot and dry weather coming on sooner in the dry season, and the wet season itself not being as big sometimes and therefore not leaving as much moisture in the soil. So again, that window gets smaller.
The New South Wales Rural Fire Service says leftover smoke from hazard reduction burns in the state should mostly clear ahead of Sunday's Sydney Marathon. Around 17,000 people registered for the 42-kilometre run through Sydney's CBD. The RFS says winds should clear most of the smoke today.
We wanted to continue enjoying
and that's the latest from ABC News.
Given environmental conditions and our quality of life, it didn't seem responsible.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
With me, Chris Mitchell, a very good morning to you. Coming up, why your holiday cottage might be costing you a whole lot more pretty soon. And with Russia and North Korea renewing relations, how worried should we be? Plus the papers with Holger Brockman.
Performance is the same as it was with the combustion engine.
The main challenge is adapting the existing structure while also guaranteeing that the new mechanisms will work. But Daniel, the mechanical engineer in charge of the design, is sure that this method can convert any concept into an electric vehicle.
Hope you're well. This Saturday, 10:35 in the east, 10:05 in the centre, and 8:35 right now in WA. So if you're renting out some holiday cabin soon, you could be paying a bit more. You could be soon slugged with a 7.5% fee. That would be on top of your nightly rate. That's if a new levy is introduced into Victoria's state parliament. Now, this would apply to short stay accommodation providers like the ones we all know, Airbnb. It would also be an Australian first if the proposal being put to State Cabinet next week is successful. Michael Fotheringham is from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. He says short-term stay accommodation is a focus right now for governments around the world.
This is part of, I guess, a broader movement across the globe to better regulate short-term letting. It is largely an unregulated market in Australia, and really we're just seeing the first signs of attempts to rein in the impact of it. And I guess one of the things to understand here is it's not just about beachside beach houses. It's also properties in the suburbs of our major cities, right across our cities. And it's a huge impact on our rental markets to have so many properties taken out of the rental market to be made available as short-term letting properties. So the idea that the Victorian government have floated is a levy, a 7.5% levy that would generate significant income for the government to try and supply new housing, particularly social and affordable housing.
On the investor side, though, a lot of those landlords are mum and dad investors. You can't imagine they'd be too happy about it. What will the impact be for them and investment?
Well, for the landlords and property owners, it's a relatively small cost. About 7% of the revenue they're generating from these properties, which would largely be passed on to the people staying in those properties. But if they're staying in hotels, they're already paying those kinds of levies and more for the much more tightly regulated markets. Some of the things that regulation brings are the safety standards that apply to hotels that currently don't apply to short-term letting properties. Fire safety standards, disability access, and the like. That at the moment the short stays are currently outside of. So one of the things that this would look to do is to move towards better regulation of that market for the protection of consumers.
Because that market really has changed a lot since the inception of then places such as Airbnb. On the idea of mum and dad investors, there was an interesting article in The Conversation this week about this cohort of investors suggesting that they, mums and dads, the rhetoric around that really masks the reality of property ownership here in the country. Should we be thinking a little bit more differently about this group?
I don't use the term mum and dad investor. It's a folksy sort of label that makes it all sound very cottage and so on. But actually what we're talking about is small scale investors. People who own 1, 2, 3 or up to a dozen or 2 dozen properties that are often managed through professional property managers. So the sense that it's sort of a folksy cottage industry thing is not really an accurate depiction. And while it's language that we've been using since the 1950s, it really doesn't apply terribly well today.
And it's not really a cottage industry when you look at it anymore. When you look at some of the numbers that The Conversation article really dug into, 20,000 landlords own around 6 properties, 70,000 landlords own 1, but 30% have declared that they've got interest in 2 or more. Does the concentration of this sort of ownership need to change if we are to attempt to start to solve the housing crisis?
Well, about a third of Australian households rent, and about 98% or 97% of those renting households are renting from small-scale investors. So it's a really significant part of our housing system. It's certainly not cottage. It's certainly not just mum and dad with one investment property that they might retire into. It's much more sophisticated than that, and operates on a much more professional basis. With the vast majority, over 70%, are managed through real estate agents or the like. So it is is quite a professional sector.
If I can just quote your comments on one final topic, Michael. There was a huge property summit this week that made headlines across all the major outlets, particularly one entrepreneur, wealthy businessman, Tim Gurner, his comments calling for higher unemployment, that the economy needs to feel a bit of pain, that there was a suggestion that tradies are lazy. He has come out and said he deeply regrets those comments that he's made. But what do you make of those comments? Are they indeed comments that are shared by the industry that no one is just really saying?
Well, look, I think, one of the things he said was that for the last few years, tradies have been paid very well to do very little. I think his PR team's been doing quite a lot this week to try and turn this around. It's not a great step. Whether his views are representative of other billionaires, I couldn't say, but I don't think it's representative of the industry as a whole. Look, the residential construction industry's had it really tough over the last few years. The pandemic and the supply chain and workforce issues that have flown from that have meant that a number of developers have gone under, and many of them are facing quite precarious situations still today. It's been called a profiter's boom because prices of supplies have grown so quickly that even though there's a lot of work to do, there's not always a lot of profit in it at the moment. So, I think the comments are not terribly reflective of anyone's view.
Michael Fotheringham talking to us this morning from the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute. Let me take you abroad. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un is continuing his visit to Russia. He's visited a plant that builds fighter jets in the far east of the country and is also due to inspect Russia's Pacific Fleet. Russian President Vladimir Putin said he gratefully accepts North Korea's invite for Russian officials to visit North Korea after the Russian president hosted Kim earlier this week. Back in 2000, Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, invited Putin to visit Pyongyang, which was the first time a Russian or Soviet leader visited the North Korean country. So what can we learn about this latest meeting? What will history tell us about the future of the Russia-North Korea relationship? Dr. Marco Durante is a historian at the University of Sydney. I spoke to him a short time ago.
Well, we really need to go back all the way back to the 1940s when the Second World War, when you had the Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula, and look at the involvement of the Soviet Union, of communist Russia at the time, in backing the communist partisans in the Korean Peninsula, fighting against the Japanese occupiers. And that is when the Soviets first began to take interest in Kim Il-sung, who they will later install as the leader of the North Korean Republic that is declared in 1948. So the Soviets are there from the outset in crafting the North Korean state and in providing a lot of economic and military assistance throughout the Cold War, though I should add there were also a lot of tensions, ideological and geopolitical, between the Koreans and the Soviets along the way.
From what you're saying, Russia in a way helped create North Korea.
Absolutely. There would be no North Korea without Russia, that's for sure. And while it was Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans who took the initiative to invade South Korea in 1950 to begin the Korean War, the Soviets were backing North Korea to the hilt, including backing their policy of unification through military means.
So if we fast forward to now, what is it that Russia wants out of this situation, do you think?
Well, I think in the end there's a very pragmatic relationship between Russia and North Korea. A lot is made of ideology when we talk about the North Korean regime. If we look historically, there was a kindred communist ideology that linked the Soviet Union and North Korea, but then also a real split in the 1970s and 80s when North Korea began to forge its own autonomous path. What you had in the era of Putin in the early 2000s is, an absence of this common communist ideology, but a kind of gradual recognition that the two states kind of needed one another for pragmatic purposes. But So I think this is a big factor. But, you know, we also have to think about the fact that Russia supported the condemnation of North Korea's nuclear program until quite recently. So, yeah, there's really been a back and forth there in terms of different geopolitical interests and the North Koreans' obvious need for economic aid from Russia.
The mainstream Western view of what's going on is, from Russia's perspective, is this shows Putin as being rather desperate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, until recently, Russia's meetings with North Korea didn't produce many results. In fact, they were kind of more symbolic than anything else. And this is the first time where we see Russia really ready to make genuine moves to provide not only economic assistance, but it looks like perhaps military technology as well. So it is a watershed moment, and undoubtedly the Ukrainian conflict has played a big role here and given North Korea a lot of leverage.
What if we throw China into the mix here as well? How do you think they view this meeting? What's their role?
Well, I think China has been historically averse to a direct bilateral relationship between Russia and North Korea. They favor a more multilateral relationship. And here we see you know, the Russians really trying to make more of a direct overture to the North Koreans on their own terms. And, you know, as much as Russia has been solidifying its relationship with China in the last few years, I think there's also always in Northeast Asia a tendency of these powers to play the others off against one another. Certainly historically, North Korea played the Soviets and China off against one another. They continue to do that after the end of the Cold War, and now Russia itself doesn't want to become a vassal of China for sure, and knows that the Chinese are going to be far more reluctant to provide military aid in the Ukrainian conflict than the North Koreans are.
Is that how you see it, that geopolitics, things are changing rapidly, or for you is this just the normal toing and froing of power?
I think what we're seeing is a change, you know, back towards what was, you know, a move forward into the 20th century, if you will. There's a lot of parallels here between the crises that emerged shortly before the First World War, and you know, a lot of parallels between what we saw also in the terrible period between 1914 and 1945, that period of total war and totalitarianism and genocide. So I see us as returning to a period of crisis. It's not that long ago, if you think about maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that Europe was seen as a bastion of progress and stability and peace and prosperity. And we really see it now tumbling down this chasm of conflict. And there's certainly a lot of specters from the past that make this very, very troubling, and I don't think we can say for sure what the future holds.
So you're saying actually that period post-Second World War of relative stability was the blip, not the other way round?
Yeah, I think, well, the Second World War, you know, was a period of relative stability in Europe because you had Europe divided into two spheres of influence, one with the Soviets and the other with the Americans, kind of carving it up in that fashion. And certainly I think that's the way Putin still sees Europe, that there is still this Russian sphere of influence, and that the West should be respecting Russia's strategic interests in places such as Ukraine. So that is the Russian mindset. That's also the mindset of some in the West on different sides of the political spectrum who are more prone to supporting Russia's position. But what we saw, you know, in the early 1990s forward is NATO changing its mission from one of defensive containment to one of supporting kind of self-determination and the independence of these nations that had split away from the Soviet Union or emerged from the rubble of the Soviet Union. So, I think what we're seeing is a number of clashing visions, and people talk a lot about Russia and Putin as seeking to restore, the 19th century Tsarist empire or the kind of Soviet empire in this region, and historical memory is so important to the Russians and for Putin. I think it's very easy for us to forget here in Australia, or my home country of the United States, how much history matters for Europeans and matters for the Russians. It's very, very, very important, or at least their interpretation of history.
If we only use history as our guide, where does the current situation end?
I can't tell you. We know from history that predictions lead nowhere. Just look at the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, which nobody had predicted. But, it's a very, very frightening situation. I think we can look at historical precedent for the outbreak, for example, of the First World War, when you had a lot of crises and smaller wars preceded, when you had certain kinds of treaty arrangements that have been in place for decades, if not centuries, that, for example, the British guarantee of Belgian neutrality, and these kind of treaty commitments ended up, catalyzing a horrific conflagration and decades of industrial slaughter. So this is just to say that we need to kind of expect the unexpected and hope for the best against the possibility of the worst.
I heard a recent academic asked if they thought the Third World War was about to begin, and he said it already has.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. We've seen historically a lot of proxy conflict. Certainly in over the last century or more, for time, maybe even time immemorial. So we don't have that kind of direct confrontation right now between these various powers that are armed nuclear arsenals, and that would be frightening indeed. So I think we're not there yet, thank God, and I hope we can avoid that. And at the same time as doing what is right.
You mentioned it yourself. Actually, it is very frightening. It's especially very frightening, perhaps, if you're younger, coming into the world with hopes and aspirations. Do you see that fear in any of the students that you teach?
I do. I think if we step back for a moment and look at the broader structures and structural changes of the last decade or so, we see the end of this optimistic belief in globalization, this optimistic belief that the world was becoming increasingly interconnected, interdependent with one another, and that this would lead to prosperity, to peace, and to democratization. And we've seen a disillusionment with this on the economic side of things, and with young people really feeling like they are in a period of economic insecurity because of these forces outside of their control. And I think we've seen this from a geostrategic and military perspective as well, with kind of increasing instability. If you look at the late 19th century, this was a period in which the world was interconnected through the steamship, through railroads, through new telecommunication technologies like the telegraph, through different lines of economic trade. People at the end of the 19th century looked at a period in which in several decades there had been no war between great powers, and they imagined that war itself could be abolished, eliminated. There was this great optimism at the time, and the First World War was not expected in that sense. And I think that was the 1890s, and I think in the 1990s a similar phenomenon emerged. And unfortunately, we're seeing now, yes, a younger generation coming into a world where those hopes have been dashed, and they are in a period of this kind of maelstrom that is consuming us all.
Dr. Marco Duranti, historian at the University of Sydney, talking to me earlier this morning. Let's get the papers. Holger Brockman's back.
China keeps up Taliban balancing act after new envoy arrives in Afghanistan, is the lead story in the South China Morning Post. Beijing is in the unusual position of maintaining an ambassador and an embassy in a country ruled by a regime it does not officially recognize. China is showing support amid the country's ongoing crisis, but is not yet ready to establish formal ties. China has made no secret of its joy over the US-Afghan debacle, mocking the rival power for failing to learn profound lessons from the Kabul moment. But it has been reluctant to fill the void, the South China Morning Post says, with pundits citing no illusions about great influence over the Taliban and lingering security risks. The Japan Times says missing Chinese defense chief signals turmoil in Xi's government. The United States believes Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu has been placed under investigation and relieved of his command, report said yesterday, in what could be the latest sign of turmoil in Chinese leader Xi Jinping's government, just over 6 months after he installed a collection of loyalist leaders in his cabinet. Still in Japan, the Asahi Shimbun says experts are warning that simultaneous outbreaks of COVID-19 and influenza are occurring in Tokyo schools, disrupting many schools and forcing classes to be cancelled. The Straits Times front page reads, "We have hit rock bottom. The only way now is up. Sri Lanka struggles to rebuild its economy. Lengthy power cuts may have ended and snaking queues for fuel may have vanished a year after angry Sri Lankans forced the ouster of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa amid an economic meltdown, but the nation is still suffering." The Jakarta Post writes, political parties have started putting together teams to help their presumptive presidential candidates in shaping their electoral strategies, with retired generals, a former attorney general, a prominent Muslim scholar and an influential businessman tapped to join. The Times of India, amid tensions with the Trudeau government over inaction against Khalistan supporters, India and Canada have paused trade talks. In the UK, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was persuaded not to resign after he was fined for breaching lockdown rules last year because of an intervention by executives working for Rupert Murdoch, the Daily Telegraph alleges.
Thanks, Holger. Let's hot foot it to the sports desk and say hello to Fraser.
Hi, Chris. Carlton AFL coach Michael Voss says he hasn't thought about team selection following their 2-point semi-final win over Melbourne at the MCG. Jack Martin will be available after serving a 1-game suspension, and Harry Mackay is expected to be fit to travel to Brisbane. It'll be Carlton's first preliminary final in nearly a quarter of a century. Voss says the team will celebrate the win before moving forward.
To be able to get to there based on where we were and the climb we've had to have, this year, let alone last year, so we'll just sort of absorb it for now, I think. We'll have a couple of days rest and then we'll somehow turn ourselves back into next week.
Reigning AFLW Premiers Melbourne will face off against the Western Bulldogs this afternoon for the Hampson Hardeman Cup. Aurora Smith will play her first game for the Dogs since rupturing her ACL on debut in Season 6. The D's have won 5 of their past 7 matchups against the Bulldogs. In other games, Adelaide will take on the Bombers for the first time, the Giants host Richmond, and the Hawks take on the Dockers. In North Melbourne, Greatfield Cracker is leading a group of Indigenous former football players who have launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse. Yvette Gray reports.
Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and moved to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to the players. The 7 players who were employed between 1975 and 2022 claim the AFL knew or ought to have known of the immediate and long-term adverse consequences of experiencing racial vilification, both physical and verbal, on the players. Cracker says he and others have been deeply affected by the comments, and the lack of support from the AFL made it worse. He says sorry doesn't cut it, and he wants to ensure the game is better than when he played.
In a statement, the AFL says it has not been served any documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it. And Newcastle prop Daniel Saifiti has been ruled out of this afternoon's NRL semi-final clash against the Warriors with a hamstring injury. The Knights arrive in Auckland riding a 10-game winning streak and would equal a club record if they can get another victory. The Warriors will welcome back halfback Sean Johnson from a calf injury that kept him out of the qualifying final loss to the Panthers. The winner will travel to Brisbane for a preliminary final against the Broncos. So, Chris, let's see if they can get it done, or will the Warriors be too strong at home?
We shall see, yes, the Knights, the surprising Knights. Okay, the weather very briefly. Brisbane 26 and sunny, Sydney hot 32 and sunny, Canberra 25 and sunny, the same in Melbourne, Hobart bucking the trend, just 17 and showers, Adelaide 24 and sunny, Perth partly cloudy and a top of 22, Darwin a sunny day ahead and a top of 34. The latest news is next.
On Thursday, for example, a cruise followed by another from Egypt.
ABC News, good morning, I'm Kerry Worthington. The law firm acting on behalf of 7 Indigenous former football players taking class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse says it expects more players to come forward. North Melbourne great Phil Cracker is leading the group who alleges the AFL failed to protect them and stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to the players. Documents were lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday and the AFL says it hasn't yet received formal notification of the action. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says the affected players ultimately want to stamp out racism in the sport.
There has been reports from more recent players that say it's not a safe work environment for Aboriginal, Indigenous or persons of colour. So the number one goal of this class action is to ensure that within the AFL this culture of violence is eradicated.
Thousands of corpses are washing up in the Libyan coastal city of Derna after a massive flood that killed more than 11,000 people. At least 10,000 others remain unaccounted for. Heavy rain saw 2 dams collapse almost completely, destroying the city. This man says the scene is horrific.
I can't describe when you see people dead, and maybe when you see one or two, you can't hold yourself, you know. But when you see maybe it's 500 people.
Libya. The Australian government will give $1 million in humanitarian assistance to Libya. The government says the money will be used to provide food, water, blankets and medical supplies to the region. French President Emmanuel Macron says the French ambassador to Niger is being held hostage in the French embassy. The ruling military junta ousted the country's democratically elected president in July. Mr. Macron says food deliveries to the embassy compound are being blocked.
In Niger, we have an ambassador and diplomatic staff who are literally being held hostage in the French embassy as I speak. Food deliveries have been prevented. They're eating military rations.
The special counsel in charge of the federal case against Donald Trump for allegedly plotting to overturn the 2020 presidential election has asked a judge to place a gag order on the former president. The BBC's Peter Bowes reports.
Jack Smith's motion to the court requesting a limited clampdown on what Donald Trump is allowed to say argues that the former president has a track record of repeatedly making inflammatory public statements which could create fear amongst prospective jurors. He says Mr. Trump knows that when he attacks individuals and institutions, he inspires others to perpetrate threats and harassment against his targets. Donald Trump, according to the US government motion, opposes the special counsel's request.
Wildlife Victoria says it needs more support from the state's government as the number of orphaned animals skyrockets and veterinary clinics across the state reach capacity trying to support wildlife in need of assistance. CEO Lisa Palmer says a record number of calls from the public this spring have left staff, volunteers and vets overwhelmed.
Our veterinary services right across the state treat wildlife on a pro bono basis, so both Wildlife Victoria and the veterinary industry are seeking more support from government.
Tasmanian-born Olympic swimming champion Ariarne Titmus is recovering after surgery to remove benign tumours from one of her ovaries. Adam Holmes explains.
23-year-old Titmus, who now lives and trains in Brisbane, has taken to social media about her health scare. The reigning Olympic champion in the women's 200 and 400 metre freestyle says she's recovering well after having 2 benign cysts removed from one of her ovaries this week. She says the 2 dermoid cysts, measuring 4 centimetres, were picked up during an MRI scan for a hip injury. Titmus told her social media followers how becoming a mother is her biggest dream, and the discovery of cysts had caused her considerable concern. She thanked her family and doctors.
Port Adelaide will host Greater Western Sydney in tonight's AFL semi-final at Adelaide Oval. Port will welcome back Charlie Dixon for the do-or-die clash, with the key forward having been sidelined with a foot injury. The Giants will get an important addition with Vice-Captain Stephen Coniglio returning to the side. The winner will secure a preliminary final berth against Collingwood at the MCG. That's the latest ABC News.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
With me, Chris Mitchell. Good morning to you. Coming up this half hour.
The bottom line is that auto workers help create America's middle class. They deserve a contract that sustains them and the middle class.
The US president says he understands why car workers are striking. And truth decay. Here, Australia's defence chief has warned that people will soon struggle to recognise fake messages. Hello, hope you're well. 11:05 in the east, 9:05 in the west this Saturday morning. The leaders of the United States, the UK and Australia have reaffirmed their commitment to the AUKUS agreement amid ongoing questions about how it will be achieved. 2 years after the deal to supply Australia with nuclear-powered submarines was first announced, the approvals needed in the US Congress are being held up. That's our North American correspondent, Jake McMillan.
Members of Congress on both sides of US politics will tell you that there is bipartisan support for AUKUS, but there is certainly a disagreement here over how those goals are going to be realised. A number of Republicans have raised concerns about the pressure that US shipyards are already coming under. They argue that the United States is failing to meet its own submarine production targets and that a lot more money needs to be spent building up that capacity before the US could look at transferring some of its Virginia-class submarines to Australia, because under this plan announced by Australia, the US and the UK, Australia would buy at least 3 of those Virginia-class submarines from the US from the early 2030s, while it goes about starting to build its own nuclear-powered subs. So concerns, those sorts of concerns have really held up legislation that will be needed to be signed off by the US Congress to formally authorise the sale of those submarines. Legislation will also need to be passed to ensure that export controls are changed so that sensitive technology can be shared between the various countries. On the other side of that debate, you've got people like Democrat Joe Courtney. He has really been one of the most public backers of this agreement so far, and he's really urged his colleagues to move with urgency here, arguing that this legislation really does need to be passed.
It's a valid concern. The U.S. Navy has its own needs in terms of its submarine fleet, but I think with the investment that we're seeing and the lead time in terms of the demand signal, we can get that cadence production above 2 Virginias a year and really satisfy both nations' navies in terms of what they need.
Well, the leaders of Australia, the US and the UK have released a statement today to mark exactly 2 years since AUKUS was first announced. They have really used that to reaffirm their commitment to this plan. Of course, AUKUS is not just being debated in Washington in the United States, but there have been plenty of questions in Australia as well about the merits of this deal and also the price tag, given that it could cost up to $368 billion. Now, in this statement, they have also referenced those challenges that still lie ahead. They have said that legislators in all 3 countries have a role to play here and that they will continue working with them to make AUKUS a reality.
As international aid begins to arrive in Libya after the devastating floods in the north in which thousands were killed, political infighting between local officials in Derna and the internationally recognised government in Tripoli are hampering the relief efforts there. Authorities in eastern Libya have denied reports that many of those who died in the devastating floods were ordered not to evacuate, but to shelter in their homes. More than 11,000 people are known to have lost their lives in Derna, where entire neighbourhoods were swept away when 2 dams collapsed. But thousands are still missing. CNN's Germana Karacha is there.
It's a scene of utter devastation here. Everywhere you turn, it's apocalyptic scenes here. It resembles a war zone. Many cities across the Libyan coast were impacted by that storm, but what happened in Derna was so different. This catastrophe, as people describe it here, was of course caused by those 2 dams that burst, unleashed all that water, the floods that swept through the city and destroyed pretty much everything in its path, washing out entire neighborhoods, entire buildings, infrastructure, families that ended up in the sea. And you speak to people here, survivors, who describe a night of horror that they went through. All this destruction, all this human loss, the thousands of lives that were lost, the more than 10,000 people who are unaccounted for right now. They say this all happened in the span of about 90 minutes. We've spoken to some survivors describing how they had to race to save their lives, their children grabbing what they can, their children, and running and trying to escape the rising waters that just kept on rising 3-story high. We heard that the waves were up to about 22 feet. And those who survived it are just traumatized. You speak to people right now who are barely able to comprehend what happened to them, what happened to their city. People are in shock. And Libyans tell you they have seen everything. They have dealt with war. They've seen death. They have dealt with loss before. But nothing prepared them for this. And right now, from what we have seen, they don't have the capabilities to deal with a disaster on this scale. There are some search and rescue teams that have come in from different countries, but they say that this is nowhere near enough. They need more. We have seen so many volunteers here in this bitterly divided country, a country where city fought city, East has been fighting West for more than a decade now. We have seen people from all across the country who have poured into Derna, who have poured into the east to try and support the people, to help. Volunteers, search and rescue, trying to help retrieve the dead bodies. In the words of one woman we spoke to earlier, saying this catastrophe has united the people of Libya, and it seems like it has, at least for now. And as we are walking around, you're constantly bumping into people with just tragic stories, one after the other. People are just walking around traumatized, trying to pick up the pieces of what's left of their lives. You know, we spoke to a number of people who told us what they had gone through. A man we met who was walking with his children, his arm, his leg bandaged, and he was so thankful that he and his children are safe and alive. And then he tells us that his father drowned in that same house. And it is story after story like this. It is just unimaginable what people in this city have gone through. And we really still don't know the real extent of the human loss here, how many people have really been killed. No one really knows, and we might not know for days, weeks, or months.
You're with us this Saturday morning on ABC News Radio. To Ukraine next, where the Ukrainian armed forces claim they've seized the village of Andrivka in the partially occupied Donetsk region. The village is just 10 kilometers south of the Russian-occupied city of Bakhmut. CNN's Frederick Pleitgen is in Ukraine.
The battle for Bakhmut is obviously one that has been going on, and Andrivka is basically south of Bakhmut. It's pretty much due south of Bakhmut. There have been battles going on there for an extended period of time. It is a very, very small place that the Ukrainians have now been able to take back. But one of the things that we can see there is that they are now very close to those Russian positions and also to some of those Russian supply lines into Bakhmut as well. Now that does give them certain ways of tampering with those Russian supply lines, with hitting those Russian supply lines, and in general increases or betters the positions that the Ukrainians have there on the front line. We've seen some of the videos that have come out from there, and certainly some of them do seem quite spectacular, like the one where that drone seems to tell the Russian soldiers to surrender. There's another one with a drone actually attacking what the Ukrainians say is a Russian vehicle with an officer in it. The Ukrainians are touting this as a big success for themselves because they say that the unit that was down there for the Ukrainians managed to smash the Russian unit, as they put it. It's obviously been a while since the Ukrainians have had a success like that. We know with the Battle of Bakhmut that it's sort of been a little bit secondary over the past couple of weeks as the Ukrainians have been trying to make their push to the south, but certainly for them, this is something that I think was very important for the Bakhmut area because they've been having some pretty tough going there as well, Lisa.
And on that point, I mean, the success for Andriivka comes at a crucial point because, of course, we have President Zelensky, Fred, going to the United States to meet with President Biden next week around, of course, the UN General Assembly meetings.
Well, I think Zelensky's message, and I think we've heard this from Zelensky in the past as well, where he is urging specifically the United States, but also some of the other partners for Ukraine to have patience with the Ukrainians and to have patience with their counteroffensive. Now, of course, we know that the main thrust of the counteroffensive is actually not in the east of the Ukraine, but in the south of the Ukraine. And there, for the Ukrainians, the going has been even tougher because of some of those very large Russian minefields, very difficult to penetrate. They have had a certain degree of success over the past month or so, but still the going there is very slow. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians now saying, look, they are showing that they can hit the Russians hard there in the east of Ukraine, that they can make gains, and certainly also that the Russians pretty much in no place along the front lines are making any gains themselves. It's been a long time since we've seen a very big Russian victory. So what Ukraine's President Zelensky is most probably going to urge the U.S. to do is to stay the course, to remain with Ukraine, to keep those weapons deliveries going. And then, of course, the things that the Ukrainians have been asking for a very long time as well, like, for instance, fighter jet, and, of course, also the thing that we've been talking about as well, those ATACMS short-range missiles, but the ones that do have a longer range because the Ukrainians do want to continue to hit the Russians in those supply lines as well.
Fred Pleitgen reporting from Ukraine. Meanwhile, Australia's defence chief has warned that people will soon struggle to recognise fake messages as artificial intelligence pushes the world into an era of truth decay. General Angus Campbell has sounded the alarm on misinformation warfare methods being rapidly deployed by regimes like Russia and China.
This tech future may accelerate truth decay, greatly challenging the quality of what we call public common sense.
Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has unleashed a new chapter in the information wars. So-called deepfake videos falsely portraying President Zelensky urging his forces to give up their fight.
As these technologies quickly mature, there may soon come a time when it is impossible for the average person to distinguish fact from fiction.
Australia's defence chief also highlighting Moscow's interference in the 2016 US presidential elections and pointing to the artificial intelligence capabilities of another potential adversary, China.
The most developed doctrinal approaches that seek to win without fighting are observed in non-Western institutions, particularly the People's Liberation Army.
But there are more immediate concerns for the Defence Force as it prepares for another scorching Australian summer. And its chief is sounding the alarm on the consequences of climate change for food and water security in years to come.
Without the global momentum needed, we may all be humbled by a planet made angry by our collective neglect.
To the United States, where car workers have gone on strike at 3 plants owned by General Motors, Ford and Stellantis. And their action has the sympathy of the President, Joe Biden. The United Auto Workers Union, the UAW, which represents more than 100,000 workers at the firms, has also warned it may widen the walkout. The union is seeking a 40% pay rise over 4 years, among other demands. The US President Joe Biden says he has sympathy with them, and filmmaker Michael Moore has also come out in support of the workers.
We were able to capture these exclusive all across the country. People have been struggling to survive. The tiny wage increases they've received in the last 20 or 30 years have not helped average, everyday, middle-class, working-class Americans keep up. So the fact that the UAW has so
they have all grown up between these walls.
gone forth here to take on all three auto companies at the same time, something that's never been done before, and stand up for this. I mean, I'm very proud of this union. All my family were UAW members. My uncle was in the sit-down strike of 1936-37 that essentially founded the UAW. It was the first contract when they took over the factories for 44 days and in the middle of winter, and really brought General Motors to their knees and made them acknowledge the union and to give the union their first contract. So all these years later, I'm filled with a great sense of pride, having been raised in a UAW family, being a union member myself, currently on strike, the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild, and it's not just us. It's 350 Starbucks locations have unionized. They voted in the union. Amazon warehouses, Chipotle's, go down the list. Young people, young adults are organizing unions. It's a very important time, and before it was hard for the unions to, for the unions to survive a strike because they would just fire everybody and hire more people. Well, right now in this country, we have 9.8 million jobs that are not filled. They can't find workers to fill them. 9.8 million. So they know, the automakers know, that they aren't just going to be able to treat the union poorly and get away with it this time. They need these workers or they can't build the cars. And the union, I think, is going to stand very strong because they have a great new president. The first one truly elected democratically by all the members in the union got to vote for the president, not just the ones at the convention. And he has got the right attitude. The executives got a 40% wage increase in their pay, the CEO and all the executives. So should the workers. They have made record profits. Even right up until right now, the 6-month period we're in right now, combined, the three automakers have made $21 billion in profits. Unheard of. This is a record. They've made off like bandits during the pandemic. They've raised the price of cars on everybody. Everybody who's tried to buy a car knows it's 30% more than it was before the pandemic. How did that happen? So they've made a ton of money. Of course, they don't want to share it with these workers who gave all this money back when Obama saved the auto industry back in 08, 09. And they had to get the union, the workers had to give up all this money to the point where new hires are only paid $15.48 an hour.
That's filmmaker Michael Moore. Here at home, international and local academics have condemned the 32 job cuts at the Australian Catholic University this week, which entirely disbands majors in philosophy and history. The redundancies follow several waves of academic strikes at the university in August. Staff protested against underpayment and casualisation. Dr. Alison Barnes is the national president of the National Territory Education Bank.
Look, there's been a wave of strike action across the sector over the last few weeks in particular. It's across Victoria University, for example, staff at the University of Melbourne went on strike for up to 7 days. There's been strikes at Monash, RMIT and Swinburne. Staff are saying loud and clear, we need secure jobs. 2/3 of people employed across our universities don't enjoy employment security. We need safer workloads and safer workplaces, and we need a fair pay rise.
And what have been the university's response to it so far?
We really need the university to come to the table and really sit down and come to agreements that are fair and equitable. Staff working conditions, student learning conditions, and we really need university management to come to the table and negotiate around ending employment insecurity, ensuring that our workplaces are safe and that we're paid fair and reasonable wages.
Is there a way for us to fix this long-term issue?
Yes, look, I think there are many ways that these problems could be resolved is. But I think what we're seeing is a reluctance on the part of university management to resolve these issues. University managements make choices, and they've made choices to drive casualisation across the sector, for example. So if university management won't do the right thing and deal with these systemic problems, we really need, I suppose, the government, through the Accord process or the review of higher education that it's currently running, step up and, I suppose, force university management to resolve these problems. We've seen this increase in aggressive industrial tactics from university management, and we really need to stop their fairly ruthless campaigns, I think, to casualise their workforce. And the like, we've got, systemic or endemic problems of wage theft across our sector, and these problems aren't new, and university management needs to get their house in order and ensure that staff are treated with the respect that they deserve.
That's Dr. Alison Barnes speaking to ABC News Radio's Wing Quang. Time to get the sport. Say good morning to Fraser.
Good morning, Chris. Melbourne AFL coach Simon Goodwin says the team will build on adversity following their season-ending 2-point loss to Carlton at the MCG. The Demons bow out of the finals with successive defeats for the second straight year, despite top 4 finishes both seasons. They've now lost 4 straight finals at the MCG since their drought-breaking 2021 premiership win in Perth. Goodwin says despite the disappointment, they've progressed as a footy club.
I think we're in a good shape to be able to continue to build, but we've got to sometimes go through these little challenges, this adversity, to really build the resilience and greatness that's required to win big games. And this is just for us, another step in our little workway that we want to go back to where we want to be.
On the other side, Carlton coach Michael Voss says the team will celebrate the win before moving forward.
To be able to get to there based on where we were and the climb we've had to have, this year, let alone last year. So we'll just sort of absorb it for now, I think. We'll have a couple of days rest and then we'll somehow turn ourselves back into next week.
A group of Indigenous former football players have launched a class action against the AFL for alleged racist abuse. Documents lodged in the Supreme Court late yesterday allege the AFL failed to protect players from and move to stop vile racial abuse on the field that resulted in life-altering damage to players. North Melbourne grade Phil Cracker, who is leading the group of 7 players employed between 1975 and 2022, says they were deeply affected by the comments and the AFL has the power to stop it ever happening again. Margalit Injury Lawyers Managing Principal Michelle Margalit says she expects more players to come forward.
For too long, racial vilification has been swept under the carpet, and there has been this overwhelming culture within the AFL of silence. No longer do these players have to be silent. They have support and they can feel confident to come forward.
In a statement, the AFL says it has not been served with any documents relating to the class action, but if any formal correspondence is received, it will review it. Shifting to the NRL, and the Melbourne Storm is into a preliminary final after beating the Sydney Roosters 18 points to 13 at Melbourne's Rectangular Stadium. The Roosters led 13-12 with under 2 minutes to play in their semi-final when Will Warbrick scored to secure victory for the Storm. Warbrick has told ABC Sport it was an exciting way to win a high-pressure match.
We kind of dream of those kind of moments, and I'm just glad I got the ball across the line, and I'm just glad we got the win. I'm so happy, proud of the team.
The Storm will take on the Penrith Panthers next Friday for a spot in the grand final. And the Broncos will be looking to secure an NRLW finals berth when they head to Sydney to take on the Dragons. Brisbane will be without prop Aneta Nuasala, who is serving a 2-match suspension for dangerous contact. Ellie Williamson and Charlotte Basham are in line to make their NRLW debut for the Dragons. In today's other game, South Sydney is pushing for the minor premiership as it gets set to host the Cowboys. And Australia's men's cricket team has suffered a second straight defeat in its ODI against South Africa, losing by 164 runs in Centurion. Alex Carey fell a run short of a century, scoring 99, with Australia all out for 252. Travis Head retired hurt due to a fractured hand, putting his World Cup campaign in doubt. Australian captain Mitch Marsh has told Fox Sports it was a tough day at the office.
We would have been happy with anywhere sort of 300 to 350 on that wicket. We know the ball travels here, and funnily enough, we still thought we were in it at the halfway point. The ball just travels here. It's a beautiful wicket, and the outfield was lightning, so we needed a couple of big partnerships at the top. We were put under pressure, lost a few wickets early, and the game is done.
The series is level at 2-2 with the final ODI to be played in Johannesburg on Sunday. So we'll see, Chris, if the Australians can get it done. It looks so promising in those first two games, but South Africa, they've really fought back on home soil.
They certainly have. I guess we should have expected that. Thanks very much, Fraser. Back tomorrow. A quick look at your weather for this Saturday. Brisbane 26, mostly sunny. Sydney 32 and sunny. Canberra 25 and sunny. If you're in Melbourne, 25 and sunny. Hobart just 17 and showers. Adelaide 24 and sunny. Partly cloudy in Perth. And you'll reach a top temperature of 22. Meanwhile, in Darwin today, you can expect a top temperature of 34 and sunny skies all the way. In around about 20 seconds or so, the latest news headlines here on ABC News Radio. After that, it's time for This Week. As ever, the next few hours on ABC News Radio. All the latest international and national news across Australia, 24/7.
Good morning, Kerry Worthington with ABC News. Volunteers are digging through mud and rubble in the Libyan city of Derna after catastrophic flooding left more than 11,000 people dead. As the BBC's Anna Foster reports, Libyan authorities are limiting access to the area while the search for bodies continues.
In terms of aid, well, the survivors that are here sitting around in these dark buildings that have in many cases no tents, no homes, no medical care, no clean water, there is very little aid that has arrived. On the journey here towards Derna, there was no international aid trucks that you might see. Instead, this was local Libyans with pickup trucks filled with mattresses, filled with water. Even as we entered the city of Derna, the Libyan National Army members were handing out face masks to try and combat some of the dust and some of the smell that exists here in this city.
An Australian-Iranian activist says Iran's morality police are still on the country's streets, intimidating women. A year ago today, Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police, and her death sparked huge protests across Iran. The 22-year-old had been arrested earlier in Tehran for failing to wear her hijab correctly. Tina Kordostami says Ms. Amini's death did empower women to push back against some of the strict laws affecting them.
The strength that these women have within Iran to leave their homes and, not wear a hijab or wear it loosely, it's incredible. But the prosecution...
Supporting Ukrainian grain will extend the ban. Member states. But Poland, Hungary and Slovakia have announced they'll extend the ban, arguing that cheap Ukrainian grain will hurt their farmers. The EU Trade Commissioner Vladis Dombrovskis says they decided to end the ban after Ukraine introduced measures to control its exports to avoid grain surges.
We currently do not see distortion of the market in those 5 member states, so therefore we are not extending the ban because it's worth noting that it's exceptional safeguard. It's not something which should be there for unlimited periods of time.
The son of infamous Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has been extradited to the United States. Ovidio Guzman Lopez is facing drug trafficking charges. It follows a global crackdown on the Sinaloa cartel, which US prosecutors allege shipped chemicals from China to make fentanyl. Guzman Lopez's father, El Chapo, is serving a life sentence in a US prison for running a global drug empire. The New South Wales government will scrap rebates and stamp duty exemptions on electric vehicles from the start of next year. Sean Tarek Goodwin reports.
The government will end the $3,000 rebate for electric vehicles as well as exemptions from paying stamp duty from the start of next year. Treasurer Daniel Mookhey argued the policies drive up the price of EVs and the money will instead be spent on charging infrastructure. Mr Mookhey announced $260 million towards charging stations in high-density residential areas as well as in regional New South Wales. The government will also be sticking to a plan to implement a road user charge for electric vehicle owners from the middle of 2027.
Victorian drivers are being urged to take care during the school holidays that start today, with last September ending up being the deadliest month for road fatalities. 28 people were killed on the state's roads in September alone, which was the highest number of fatalities for the month in 16 years. There have already been 11 deaths this month. TAC CEO Tracy Slatter says the school holidays are always a higher risk, with people taking longer drives on unfamiliar roads.
So it's a real reminder to us all to be safe, to plan our journey, to take rest, to wear our seatbelts and to drive within the speed limit and to the conditions.
The Queensland Government says extra rangers will be sent to Gari after a number of high-risk dingo incidents on the island. In July, a woman was attacked by a pack of the wild dogs while jogging on Orchard Beach. Environment Minister Leanne Linnard says 10 new rangers will be recruited by the end of the year to boost safety.
What we've seen is the behaviour of some of the Wangari on the island. I'm advised by rangers, they're young males as they're growing, they might be competing for seniority amongst the pack. But when that's coming in contact with a lot of visitors on the island and some are taking risks, that's a real concern.
ABC News.
Hello, I'm James Glenday, coming to you from Canberra on Ngunnawal country. Welcome to This Week. Now, this week was a big moment for some of the poorest Australians who are hoping for somewhere to live. The Prime Minister's signature social housing policy finally passed through Parliament.
Every Australian deserves the sense of connection and community and dignity and stability that a home provides. This security gives you the opportunity